Good morning, afternoon, or evening. My name is Rafael, and I'm thrilled to be here at JavaScript Days 2024. As a passionate software developer specializing in front-end technologies, I had the privilege of working on various projects at Augmenta Software, with a particular focus on Sencha and Ext JS. In my journey as a developer, I found my home in crafting engaging user experiences and intuitive interfaces. Currently, my go-to tool in this endeavor is the Ext JS, a framework that has not only become my primary companion, but has also inspired much of my work. Beyond my day-to-day coding adventures, I've extended my commitment to the developer community by creating content on Ext.js and programming in general. You can catch me sharing insights, tutorials, and tips on my YouTube channel SonaDev, with a special emphasis on supporting Spanish-speaking developers. I aim to contribute to our vibrant community and make complex concepts accessible to all. Today, I'm very excited to share a tutorial that dives into the intricacies of creating a Kanban board using Ext.js. It's a topic close to my heart, and I hope you find it both insightful and enjoyable. Without further ado, let's embark on this journey together and explore the wonders of Ext.js in building an efficient Kanban board. Thank you for having me, and let's make this session as interactive and enriching as possible. Okay, and now that we have set the stage with a brief introduction, let's dive into the core of our discussion. Our agenda for today is packed with valuable insights, and I'm excited to guide you through each step. First up, we'll start with Custom Components 101. Understanding the fundamentals of custom components is crucial for our journey into creating a robust Kanban board using Ext.js. So, buckle up as we explore the basics together. Once we have laid the groundwork, we'll transition seamlessly into the heart of our tutorial, the Kanban board, and all the tools and resources that you need to follow this tutorial. With the stage set and the tools in hand, we'll then start with the much anticipated Kanban board tutorial. This is where theory meets practice, and I'll guide you step by step through the process of creating your own Kanban board using Ext.js. Finally, I'll open the floor for any questions you may have during the Q&A session. Your engagement is essential, so feel free to ask anything, share your thoughts, or seek clarification on the questions box in GoToWebinar. Let's start. Custom Components 101. In the case of Ext.js Framework, we have an impressive set of over 140 ready-to-use components, including tables, charts, buttons, forms, calendars, and much more. This forms the foundation of our development, but today we'll delve even deeper into the ability to create and adapt these framework components to our needs or specific cases. To do this, we need to understand a couple of things, the first of which is the importance of custom components. Although the Ext.js library is robust, the ability to customize components is essential when facing specific requirements for our projects. Customization not only allows us to adapt existing components, but also create modular and composite solutions that fit perfectly with our needs. There's primarily two main types of customization. The first one is enhancing an existing component. It's not always necessary to start from scratch or try to reinvent the wheel. Enhancing an already existing component in Next.js allows us to leverage the features already developed and focus solely on key modifications. A practical example of this case would be taking a component, maybe think of a date picker, which you want to enhance so that it can get a date range, which is basically two dates from a single calendar, like the ones we see on hotel reservations or airplanes web pages. We can also add extra validations or properties if we need it. The other way we have is creating a composite component. These components are crucial when we need more complex functionalities that involve the interaction of various elements. Let's consider a scenario where we need a form that combines different fields, selections, and actions buttons to later provide the values to the backend. This already by itself is a custom component, but this form it can also be part of a grid, and by encapsulating this in a composite component, we would have the ease of reusing it as many times as necessary without rewriting code as a single component, with both the grid and the form. Now, let's see some of the basic steps to create a custom component. First, we need to understand the requirements. Before starting, it's essential to have a clear understanding of the requirements and desired functionalities. We then begin by extending base components of Ext JS or the framework we are using. This provides us with a solid foundation and saves time in the development phase. We can take a component like a grid and add specific functionalities, such as custom pagination or handling specific events. We then leverage configurations. In the case of Ext JS, it offers a wide range of configurations to customize components. We will explore in our example how to use these configurations to make our components highly adaptable. And finally, we use custom events and methods. Defining custom events and methods is essential for creating flexible components that can adapt to various situations. Great! Now that we have a better understanding of a custom component, let's dive into creating our Kanban board. To follow this tutorial, I'll be using Sencha XJS 7.7, along with Sencha Command and Visual Studio Code as the editor. Let's embark on this journey of building a Kanban board with the powerful tools and framework at our disposal. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them on the question box, and if we have time, I'll try to answer them all at the end. Let's start coding. Well, now let's move on creating a Kanban board. Once again, the key to learning about custom components is to make the most out of the tools provided by the framework we are using for our front end. In this case, as I previously mentioned, I am utilizing the Sencha XGX framework. Hence, this tutorial will be more straightforward to follow if you are using this particular framework. Right here I have already created a basic project using Sencha command. It is pretty straightforward. You just use the generate app command and you can define the toolkit of your preference. In this case, I will be using the classic toolkit. Once this app is already created, we can start programming our Kanban board. To kick things off, I'll create a panel in the main view dedicated to this Kanban board. For this particular layout, I have already set up a basic panel, but let me give you a quick rundown. This Kanban view panel inherits from the XJS class panel.panel, and it includes an X type that will allow me to reference it when it needed. I also have my array of requires. This one functions similarly to the includes in any other programming language. After that, I specify that the layout for this panel will be of the type fit, and in an array of items, I will place another panel. By doing this, if I also add a title, we can observe that I have effectively nested one panel within another. For the sake of this organization and to maintain certain order, I will create my Kanban board itself in my UX folder. I typically use this naming convention to indicate any custom component I create, making it easy to locate quickly regardless of the number of times it has been reused in different sections or throughout my project. Now, right here, I will create my file, and I'll call it something obvious, like kanbanboard.js. Once again, I emphasize the path since it is within app.ux.kanban.kanbanboard, and this is how my class will be defined. Just as the last class we did before, this one is inheriting from the panel.panel class. And lastly, I will assign it an X type, Kanban board as its name. In addition to specifying its scroll type, I will add its array of requires, but for now, I'll leave it empty. And the same will be for its config parameters and its array of items. Inside this array, I will define each one of my columns. For now, I will manipulate it manually, but I will remove them later. It's just to illustrate where to place each of the columns. I will also write some of the titles for now, just to keep it simple. Now, I will put Kanban board as a child of the view we generated initially, Kanban view. I will place it here in the array of items with its type. And I will also add the class name to the requires array of my view. This way, one will be nested inside the other. Now, returning to my Kanban board, I see the need to define a layout for how these columns should be displayed. To achieve this, in Ext JS, I'll utilize the layout parameter, setting it to hbox, along with the align parameter having a value of a stretch. Now that it has a layout, it would be ideal to assign them a width. I can do this one by one, or I can use the defaults parameter, allowing me to specify all the common parameters for the children in the items array. Here, I will set flex to distribute the columns and their dimensions proportionally. Now, if I visualize it in my browser, this is the current state of the Kanban board. Now, moving forward, my view will take charge of specifying the columns rather than defining them directly in this section of the component. I will pass the columns and I will also pass the store, which at the moment, I'll name it something like Kanban store, even though I haven't created it. Also, it is worth mentioning the name of its class here as well. Again, I haven't created it, so I'm just doing this thinking ahead for reference. It is crucial to remember that the store acts as a data repository connecting the backend and managing the information that will be displayed in my components. Now I could set the title here. Instead of the generic column 1, column 2 as I had it before, the concept behind this Kanban is to make it look like a real application. Therefore, I'll give it a focus reminiscent of an HR or a human resources application. Something kinda like a board tracking the hiring processes within a company. I will now designate my first column with the title identified, as it represents the initial stage where potential candidates are identified. Additionally, I'll assign a column ID, denoted, well, as you guessed it, column ID. This is specifically a requirement from my backend, with which I've been collaborating to retrieve corresponding values. So I'll set the value to 1, matching the identifier in my backend. Similarly, I'll proceed to create the other columns: identified, interview, accepted, and hire. While I'll be actively working with these columns, it is essential to note that you can adapt and customize the number of columns based on your specific requirements. Now, transitioning to my Kanban board, currently my configuration lacks of any specific settings, but I'll introduce some default values. The store will be set to null, and I'll initialize the columns parameter as an empty array. The subsequent task involves reading these columns, the ones received as parameters, and incorporating them within the items array. I'll execute this operation within my init component method, precisely because I'm utilizing the classic version of Ext JS. This organizational step ensures the proper setup of the Kanban board based on the dynamic input received. Remember that whenever I use the init component, as I am overriding an existing method, I have to use call parent to execute it from the class we are inheriting. So, to read these columns that we receive, it depends a lot on where we create them. In this case, I'll do it after the call parent. Therefore, I'll have to review a couple of things before generating it. Firstly, I'll ensure that the store and the columns are defined, because proceeding without them makes no sense. Therefore, if the store is not null and the columns are also not null, with the length greater than 0, then I'll proceed to iterate over the columns array and create them. I'll employ a pretty straightforward loop, although any other JavaScript or XJS loop could have been used here. Now I'll create the column and then insert it into my items array. To achieve this, I'll establish a variable named column, and this is where its creation will take place. Continuously, I'll be reading from the me.columns, extracting the current element I'm iterating over, so I'll designate it as column data, fetching its value from the me.columns at the current index. Now, I will specify it to generate a panel, although in reality at this point I'm creating another custom component to use it here as a column. I'll also be passing the title received with this column, denoted as column data.title. I may also indicate that if it's not defined, it should default to column concatenated with the current iteration index using an OR condition. In addition, I want to pass the store so that each column can independently connect to my backend and retrieve the corresponding information. I will also include the column ID as a parameter. Now I have successfully created the column, but it's currently in memory, so it hasn't been added to my board yet. I will utilize me.add, where I will append this column. By doing so, we can once again review the outcome in my browser, and you will observe that the 4 columns I just created are now visibly displayed as intended. The next step we are going to do involves adding some styles and customizations to enhance the visual appeal of my Kanban board. I will create a file name with the same name but with the CSS or SAS extension, and I won't go into much detail due to time constraints and because, well, this is JavaScript days, not CSS days. So I already have here my CSS code prepared. I'll paste it here, and essentially what I'm crafting are styles for the board container and individual column containers. Additionally, I'm styling the task selector for dragging each column. Finally, within each column, I've specified variations of colors that can be used based maybe on the title. So, for example, if I go to my columns and define that for the identify column, maybe the color is like gray. For the next one, it could be something like yellow, maybe, and maybe for accepted could be blue, and for the last column I envisioning something using like green for higher. To apply these colors, I'll navigate to my Kanban board. Here I will utilize the user class or user CLS and append the class name defined by my CSS. Also concatenating the color pass in the column. In case it's not defined, again using an OR conditioner, I will provide another color which will default to black. For the last one, I will add CLS and specify the other class I created for the columns. Similarly, for my Kanban class, I will use CLS to define its CSS class, corresponding to the board container. By implementing these styles, the visual representation of my Kanban board will be significantly improved, offering a more engaging and personalized user experience. To appreciate these style changes and visualize my application in its entirety, I typically execute the command Sencha app watch in my project's terminal. This command not only allows for the reconstruction of my application, but also generates a virtual server in my browser, facilitating real-time monitoring of my changes. So it may take a few seconds. Once ready, we can confirm the presence of the columns defined in our view, each one adorned with the colors and styles that we personalize using CSS. Now it's crucial to remember that in this section that we left here, we are creating a panel, but our goal is to employ a custom column component. column component, sorry. So consequently, we'll proceed to create a new class in my folder, naming it Kanban column. Following the same methodology as before, we define the class, specifying its location within my project, indicating the framework component it inherits from, and assigning it a distinct name or X type. In this case, I will use Kanban column. By developing this custom column component, we aim to encapsulate functionality and styling specific to individual columns, enhancing modularity and maintainability within our Ext JS application. I will define the layout as fit and add the CSS class, which, if you recall, is the one I generated for this component exactly. Once it's set up this way, I'll take the class name and use it instead of the panel we left. It is also crucial to remember to add the class name to the required section of this class to ensure its proper functioning. Now let's go back to my Kanban column. Similar to the board, this class will require various properties, including the config to handle some default parameters. These parameters would be the store, which I will leave as null, and my column ID, necessary for my backend. Now I'll create my items array within this panel, and my only item would be the data view component itself. This one requires some specific parameters. The first one being an item selector, which is kind of a CSS class defining the redundant item selector. It also requires a TPL or template, because the data view, what it will do is to cycle through this template to create each of the elements based on it. I already had this block of code defined here to save some time. In reality, this is CSS, and what it does is using my task selector class, which inside has a title and another content section containing an icon and a text. Each of these, the title, the icon, and the content, is fetched from the backend, and similarly it gets updated throughout my store. Just as we did before, using the init component would be the best place, or the best way to read that store. So here I'll use call parent, then reference the items and obtain the first item, which is the data view, and specify a new store. I could here directly pass the me.store I'm receiving, but what I want is to append the column ID. So what I will use is the ext.apply, where it will take that structure or that object and add the column ID. In fact, before continuing with this, I should check if my store is not null. Because, well, if it is, then there is no point in proceeding. Very well. Now, once it's set up like this, the next crucial step is to create my store. Since we are continually checking for its existence, having it in place before proceeding is, well, essential now to prevent encountering any errors. The basic structure of my store was already initiated here. As a reminder, a store is a pivotal component where the connection with my backend is executed. It also serves as a data warehouse, facilitating the retrieval and storage of information. When connected to a view, the store plays a crucial role in fetching and updating data. In this section, I define my store class, naming it Kanban store. Subsequently, I inherit it from the base Ext JS store and assign an alias. This alias is of significant importance, as it ensures consistency with the one that we defined earlier. The alias acts as a convenient reference, linking the store to any other components within the application. Understanding the significance of a store is key, as it acts as a bridge between the front end and back end, managing data and allowing seamless interactions within the application. I added a few more parameters to my store configuration, such as remote, filter, and sort. These parameters enable me to efficiently organize the structure of my data directly from the backend. Additionally, I included autoload, a setting that ensures my data loads automatically when the store is initialized, and the column ID is set to 0. I'll explain the reason for that shortly. Next, I configure my proxy, specifying that it is of type REST. The URL to my endpoint being on a local server, well, is denoted as backend/handlers/Kanban. Finally, I define some properties for reading my data, including root, ID, and total. This last part features a listener, which I skip mentioning, but basically this listener takes the column ID and integrates it into the proxy. This is like a way of providing, this is providing like a way to add these extra parameters. And now, if my store is complete and everything else is correct, we can proceed to test it. And here it is. Let's see if it's loaded correctly. Yes, indeed. We have made some significant progress. One could say that maybe the entire visual part of our Kanban board is completed now, and the only thing left to do is to implement like the functionality. So we will continue with precisely that by adding the functionality to our Kanban board. We primarily have two main options to start working with. One is using a drag zone, responsible for initiating the drag operation, and the other is using a drop zone, which handles the dropping of the drag item. These are the components that will provide the necessary functionality for dragging and dropping elements. What I will do first is use a listener, specifically the render listener. This listener is called just before the element is displayed on the screen, right before it's rendered. It receives several parameters, but the first one is the data view. That's why I'm using me to save myself from having to declare let me equals this. Now, when it comes to drag and drop functionality, a few basic principles are crucial. The drag zone is responsible for marking an element as draggable, typically initiated by a mouse down event. The drop zone, on the other hand, accepts the dragged element and handles the drop event. Both zones must be properly configured and communicate with each other for a seamless drag and drop experience. And what I will do here is initiate my drag, so I'll add a comment here indicating the start of the drag. Instead of using this, I'll use me, taking advantage of what we did earlier. I'll set up a drag sub object like this. Drag zone equals. Now this object requires several things. The first is the getElement method to retrieve the DOM element, followed by a series of parameters. What I will do now is directly introduce two methods, one called getDragData, which is an event method, and the other is getRepairXY, which essentially repairs the coordinates. It's a bit more technical, and I won't go into much detail, but it's somewhat straightforward for this case, so I'll program it right away. In this example, it returns the x and y coordinates. Now, returning to getDragData, I'll obtain the source or base element, to avoid confusion. I'll get it from the getTarget event, and I'll obtain my element me.itemSelector. Again, I'll emphasize that some of these terms are specific to what would be the data view, and we don't have much time to go into detail about it. After successfully obtaining the base element, I'll continue. The first thing I'll do is to duplicate this element, which is useful for maintaining visibility while dragging. So, I duplicate the base element by cloning the node, and then I'll create a new ID using the Ext JS method called Ext.id, which generates a unique ID for the application. Next, I'll return a series of parameters required by this method. The first is to send the duplicate, which is ddl. Then, it asks for a base element as source L. It also requires the starting zone or source zone to know where the element was taken from. I will pass that using me. Next, it asks for a store, which we already have. Then, for repairing the coordinates, I'll use repairXY. I won't explain much, but I will use x.fly with the base element to obtain the x and y coordinates. Finally, it asks for the record being dragged, so I'll set it as me.getRecord and use the base element. Now that I have it set up this way, I can review it. What this does is generate a small duplicate element when dragging, a little box with the data of the record. I could also apply styles to it with CSS if I wanted. We can see that it has a cross, indicating that it cannot be dropped, so for now it will always return to its original position. handle this, we'll use the drop zone. Here, I'll set up the end of the drag operation, just like we did with the drag zone, and we will configure some series of methods. There are many more that can be configured here, but the idea of the exercise is to keep it as simple as possible, not to complicate things too much. So it's a similar method that also requires the same element, me.getL, and some methods and events. The first one I'll create here to simplify the work is a custom method to check if it's possible to drop the element here. The native Ext JS method receives a specific variable that we are not currently using. So what I will do is modify it to accept allowed as a boolean. If it's true, it will give me one value, and if it's false, it will give me another. This will determine whether to display a checkmark or a cross. The other two events I will work on are notify over and container drop. The notify over event comes with a parameter, the source itself, and what I want to return here is whether it's possible to drop the element. So I will put allow drop, and what I will check is if the source is outside the drag zone. But before I start testing, I'll add the container drop, which also receives the source. This method is supposed to be called when I release the mouse, and if I'm in the column where I started, it will exit because I don't want to drag it over the same column. This is because it will change the organization of the data, placing it at the end of the column. After this, the next step is to obtain the record, and I achieve this by accessing the source, which, as a reminder, is the parameter labeled before as drag record. Now, the subsequent action involves removing the record that is currently being dragged. I achieve this removal from the source using the code source.dragdata.sourceStore.removeRec. This essentially removes the record from the source store. Following this removal, the next thing to do involves adding the record to the area where it's currently being dropped. In other words, I'll add this newly obtained record to the store of the new column. This process ensures that the record is appropriately relocated to the new column store, effectively reflecting the updated data organization based on the drag and drop action. So, in this section, I've taken the record, save it as rec, remove it from the previous list, and now added it to the new one. With this, the functionality should be in place. Of course, if I'm communicating with my backend, I need to update the new column to persist the changes. Oh, by the way, it's important to mention that here I should call this .allowDrop, because if not, it would be looking for it within its element, and it should be accessed from the outside. Now that it's ready, we can start testing it on the browser. Upon dragging, we see that the cross is displayed in this column, but when I drag it to the column where I can drop it, it changes to a checkmark and moves to that position. By the way, if we remove this conditional, it would allow us to drop it on the same column from where it originated. However, this would rearrange the data as it would always send that record to the end, potentially, well, causing some confusion. That's why we keep it in this way. So now our Kanban board should be fully functional. Here's a version with more records. And remember that you can also add the columns you need to our custom component. You should also remember that the concept behind following exercises like this is to provide foundational support and serve as inspiration for incorporating the learned concepts into more extensive projects or maybe enhancing already existing applications. From here to this project, you can maybe add some uh, forms for maybe record creation and updating, or perhaps a grid that can display all the records that you already have. The point is that the possibilities for scalability are maybe endless, and the decision to enhance the Kanban board depends on the specific requirements of your project and the needs of your users. Remember that software development is an iterative process, and improvements can be made incrementally based on feedback and evolving requirements. So for now, the tutorial has provided, well, at least I hope it has provided a solid foundation for a simple yet powerful Kanban board. I really appreciate your attention, and I hope this discussion has been enjoyable and insightful for all of you. For now, let's now continue with the JavaScript Days 2024 program. Thank you all very, very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Rafael.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So, yeah, please go ahead and continue to post in your questions for Rafael directly into the GoToWebinar control panel there. And we'll be taking your questions as we come through. And just a reminder, as we finish the Q&A today, we will put up a link for you to provide any feedback on today, and to keep an eye out for your registrations for tomorrow coming through. So I've got a first question here. Obviously, there's lots of different frameworks and bits that you can use. Why did you choose Ext JS for building the Kanban board? And did it provide you any advantages over using any other frameworks?
Well, I think in my case, Ext JS was firstly choose because it's my main work tool. It has, well, as you know, a very rich set of ready-to-use components. It has extensive tooling, which is Sencha command. Has a very comprehensive documentation, and its component-based architecture and support for creating these custom components make it a powerful choice for building sophisticated user interfaces.
Okay, yeah, cool. Yeah, I really liked how you put that together, and it was nice seeing kind of the different elements of Sencha just kind of pulling together to make it really easy. So you just didn't need to worry too much of the plumbing, just be able to build the new X type and get it going, which is pretty cool. Yeah, Stuart's here asking, can you explain the significance of choosing a specific Ext JS toolkit, such as classic or modern?
I think the choice between the classic and modern toolkit, well, it's crucial as it depends on factors like the platform. If it's classic, it's more used like for desktop application, or if it is modern, is used like for mobile experiences. So there's that. There's also the user experience preferences, the development approach, also the project requirements, or maybe even the browser compatibility. So well, as I said, like classic is ideal for traditional desktop application, while modern is more tailored for touch-enabled devices and more modern web standards. So I think to choose the toolkit, you need to base your project on specific needs and your specific goals.
Yeah, and I think as was discussed in one of the earlier sessions, obviously, we've got the classic and the modern toolkits, but the models that you're building behind it, the data store access and everything else like that is common code that you can share between any visualization version, if it's kind of classic or modern. Your business logic and your core backend connectivity for pulling all that data in and loading it and managing it it's just part of the model. So the view controller, I think, is just a separate thing that you then plug on top of that. So yeah, very, very quick and easy to share the code between the two. Okay. There's a question here. Laura really likes the presentation. Are you able to share the code as a sample after the presentation?
Yeah, I think we can work something out, maybe a GitHub repository or something. I cannot share, as you know, like the complete XJS well framework, but I can maybe show you the code or how to process it, and I think this presentation will also be for the view of the audience in YouTube, so maybe they can follow if we post any repository right there, right?
Yeah, that sounds like a great plan. We'll work out somewhere to get it up on a GitHub repo somewhere, if it's on Rafael's or wherever, and then when we post the replay up onto YouTube, we'll make sure the link is in the comments below. So if you're watching this on YouTube, have a look in the comments below, and we'll be able to make sure that we've got the link there ready for you to have a look at. Lucas asks, with the control that you just built there, are the columns scrollable? So if there's too many tasks in a column, can you scroll up and down?
Well, I didn't actually put it here, but it's like just a property that you can add to the layout that you're having with the columns. So yeah, it can be done pretty easily.
Awesome. Yeah, it's one of the great things about using a component set like Sencha is that with so many years experience behind it, these type of questions have come up many times before. So there's typically a property that you can set up and play with. And if you want to play around with some of the specific controls when you're trying to work out how to implement and use them, the kitchen sink is a great place to kind of go and do that from the Sencha documentation sites. Right, Derek's asking here, you showed the store class having column ID 0 and said you explain that bit later. Could you explain that part? And apologies if you already covered it and I missed it.
I think I didn't explain it quite well, but basically the column ID is just like a field that my backend is requiring. Is like for organization of the columns that I'm declaring for the layout that I will have. Basically, it just tells the backend where my data register is located. If it's column 0 is the first column, then or 1 is the next column, and so on. So that's just like a field that my backend is requiring.
Okay, so basically the category that the data needs to fit into, you matched up with the column IDs, and yeah, okay, cool. Paul says, amazing example, thank you very much. There are many commercial applications available built with JavaScript that provide connectors to popular tools such as Jira, for example. I guess it's probably a question for the management team really, rather than for Rafael, but does Sencha plan to add any further data connectors to the classic modern toolkits to further enhance their capabilities? And if I don't know if Andres is still online. If you're around, maybe if you know the answers to that one. I think basically if there's connectors and stuff out there and you want to use them, then there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to connect up to them and then just link them up to the data store. There's one of the examples that we spoke about earlier was the building the mobile, the email client, and that goes through and builds up, and that connects up to RAD server as a backend, for example. And that's just kind of a REST endpoint that you can call to collect the data and pull that data down into the data store within Sencha, and allow its data store model to take over the management of that data. So you could use any other connector to go fetch data and pull that into the data stores, and that data store then just acts as the engine to pull the data in as it needs to, and then binds it through to the controls on the client side. So you should probably be able to go ahead and do that today, Paul. Let's have a look. Are there any optimization tips that you can suggest to help with the load speed and the runtime performance of applications as you're building them?
Well, I think that for performance optimization in Ext JS, it usually involves techniques such as bundling and minification of JavaScript and CSS. It can also has some of lazy loading components, utilizing Sencha command to optimize your application, and depending on that of course of the kind of build that you're using, maybe it's meant for production build or maybe a development build. Also, you can implement some efficient data loading strategies like virtual loading if you have like a large set of records or maybe an infinite grid. there's pretty much some strategies that you can follow to optimize the speed of your application.
Yeah, and I think the important thing is to remember this, it's about web application building rather than necessarily kind of a website, having the state and the management and everything that's going on. Once you get that initial pull, it makes it blazingly fast to have a performant web application. And I think the interactions that Rafael showed with the columns and everything just show how good the components are at kind of bringing that kind of stuff to life. So, which is pretty cool. So, great question. Thank you very much. Just have a quick look down. I think we got the main part of the questions that have come through here. There's another question here from Daniel, actually. Would it be handier, better to use a chained store instead of adding and removing records from the list view?
Well, I think using chain store could indeed be a handy alternative. Maybe it can allow for a more declarative approach. It can maybe reduce the manually add and remove records from the list view, and it will be like chaining stores, and can be used like for creating filter or sort the records. But I am not pretty sure how would I implemented this. Maybe I can try to do an example and work this out, but I think it could indeed be a handy alternative.
Okay, cool. All right, Rafael, anything else that you wanted to add to the end of this session?
No, I think pretty much that's everything I want to tell you. Again, thank you for inviting me to this event, and I hope to be considered to many other events in the future.
Yeah, and a huge thank you for stepping up and getting this session done. It was really cool to see. And again, what I love about the sessions today is that building this Kanban board with an Sencha app with that Ext type now. That code is now ready to be able to use in a Sencha application. We saw earlier today how Ext can enable you to use that in a React application. So the work that you do with these Sencha components is something that opens up a lot of doors to be able to take things out and do some amazing things with them, which was fantastic. So yeah, awesome. Thank you very much.